Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. So we're back now. The academic year has begun again, and we've decided to resume as our topic for these occasional Saturday morning encounters the biodata-focused approach that seemed to go down quite well last time. Ours is an age perhaps of celebrities, personalities. It's easier to relate to ideas when incarnated in human beings. So rather than give you anything too abstract and conceptual, I thought I'd indicate what is, after all, the Islamic principle of mu'amala, that ideas, concepts, values, principles make sense and are most humanly osmotic when represented to us in other human beings. So we're going to begin by rewinding to one of the lectures which we gave in the previous academic year. You'll recall the topic was the subject of Hazrat Nizamuddin Awliya, the great patron saint of the city of Delhi. Not because I want to retell that story, but just to try and help us to consider how things have changed and how things have not changed. That was the 14th century, died 1325, and became really the great unleasher of the primary energies of Mu'aynuddin Chishti subsequently, and made the tariqah a mass movement, an engine of Islamization and conversion. You'll recall that at the age of 23 he became the Khalifa of Baba Farid, who was separated by only one name, Bakhtiyar Kaki, from Mu'aynuddin Chishti of Ajmer himself, so a very high sanad, and becomes this incredible powerhouse of Islamization. And he is generally regarded as the founder of the Nizami branch of the Chishtiya. But there's another one which in so many British mosques is better known, which is the Sabri branch. If you look at those picturesque posters in the Brelvi mosques in particular for the next Milad Sharif or some Orf, you'll see that it's the Sabiriya who tend to prevail with a particular presence in Kashmir, Mirpur and those places. And the Sabiris come from another branch from Baba Farid, Maulana Ala Eddin Sabir. Sabir, not actually his name, but a eponym, just means patient, a person with sabr because of various feats of endurance and zuhud that he represented during his lifetime. And his mother was actually Baba Farid's elder sister, a lady by the name of Jamila, so there's a genealogy there. And his famous, as an example of his sabr, they still tell you this story today, that even though he was entrusted by Baba Farid to look after the langar, the place where everybody would be fed and the poor would be accommodated at the dargah. He was in charge of it for 11 years, but thought it was not appropriate that he should eat from this food himself because it was food for sadaqah. And so after serving everybody, the usual scene of enormous cauldrons of rice and ghee, and he would, after cleaning up, he would go off into the nearby sort of forest and wilderness area. Middle Ages, so much of India was uncultivated, and find some roots and berries on which he nourished himself for 11 years. So it's an example of the principle of wara, of scrupulousness, that the ulama tend to maintain in not eating from the income of awqaf and that which is destined for the poor. So this is the principle of the Chishtiya Sabiriya, and it continues to be a principle to this day. So we now fast forward to see how this tariqah engages with the new environment of colonial India. The end of the Delhi Sultans, and then the decline of the Mughals, the First Indian War of Independence, the so-called Mutiny, 1857, and the very hard questions posed to the ulama and the Sufis across the course of the 19th century regarding the relationship to this new non-Muslim polity with its unheralded military and infrastructural prowess. How could these ancient saintly traditions, these ways of holiness, actually fit in what was nominally a Christian, but in practice a kind of materialistic, pragmatic, imperial, colonial reality? How could this face-off actually develop? So we fast forward to Saharanpur, central India. 1814 is the birth of somebody called Imdadullah Muhajir Makki, who's a kind of name to be conjured with in Deobandi and Proto-Deobandi circles to this day, who represents a latter-day instantiation of this Chishti Sabiri principle, including he lives in the forest for 6 months just for his ibadah and his zuhud, and then conceives a great longing for the city of Medina and finds his way on a pilgrim ship. One of the ironies of British rule is that it's actually easier to be connected to the Haramain now than it used to be. And then in the first Indian War of Independence, 1857, he leads an army against the British and is briefly victorious, and then finds himself persecuted and exiled to the Hijaz, and lots of stories are told about him and his zuhud, very representative of this tradition. For instance, he maintains the ulama's tradition of marrying people who are in need rather than our current sort of checklist approach. So she has to have this kind of complexion and she has to have a PhD and she has to be blah, blah, blah. Otherwise, our ego is not satisfied. It's a custom of the ulama, and you find this in Ibn Hajar and some of the medieval Middle Eastern ulama as well, to look for people who are needy. So his wife is a blind widow and he cares for her, and this becomes one of the traditions of the tariqah. So he dies at the end of the 19th century, still in the Ottoman period, and is buried at the Mu'alla, which is the big cemetery in Mecca. Generally in the subcontinent you find quite often people call themselves Makki or Madani, they like titles. This doesn't really necessarily mean that they spent a lot of their lives in those places. It's more an indication of what they would call an ishtiyaq, in other words, a particular spiritual connection. You have a great longing, a particular sense that you need to be in Mecca or Medina, and therefore that spiritual allegiance, that affinity is what is generally alluded to by these monikers. So he writes a tafsir, the Iqlil al-Quran, but mostly Haji Imdadullah is famous for producing an outpouring of amazing Persian poetry and commentaries on the great Persian Sufi poets. He has one of the great commentaries on the Masnavi of Maulana Rumi, for instance. So somebody who is already a completely traditional Persianate subcontinental alim, but is having to deal with the British and is riding steamers to the Haramain and is straddling the two worlds. And in many ways, that East-West dichotomy was more intense for people in the 19th century than it is for us today, because we're already so westernized. Look at the way we're dressing, and we eat pizza, and we're already kind of hybrid creatures. But back then, it was a much more intense and absolute thing, and it was experienced as such not just by the Indians, but by the British as well. It was two worlds, and how you inhabit or cohabit with two worlds was one of the big questions for the ulama, really across the ummah. One of his leading disciples was Maulana Rashid Gangohi, again a favourite for the nostalgics of the Deobandi tradition, also from Saharanpur, and along with somebody called Maulana Qasim Nanawutbi. They are both murids of Haji Imdadullah, so they're from this Chishti Sabri tariqah, and together they are generally regarded as the co-authors of Darul Ulum Deoband. So Gangohi becomes the first director, and also the sister college, Mazahir al-Ulum in Saharanpur, which is kind of from the same period and has the same orientation. And he dies a little bit later in 1905 and remains in India. So Deoband, obviously one of the major sort of transformations in the intellectual infrastructure of the subcontinent in the 19th century. And what's really going on there is that they see the inevitability of British power. They have decided not to leave, to go to those few Muslim places that are still independent, Afghanistan, the Ottoman Empire, wherever, they're going to try and hang on in order to reform the Muslims. Later on, the Tablighi Jamaat movement comes out of the same kind of circle and mentality. But to create networks of scholars in a more formal way than had been normal beforehand. Most of Islamic history, madrasas are kind of founded by some local bey or prince, and he brings somebody to teach there, or the scholar founds it and gets an endowment. It's very local. It's not really networked with anything or anyone else, with a few exceptions. But in the 19th century world, where India is kind of being united by railways, telegraph, post offices and things, these Deobandi scholars decide they're going to create a centre which will then create sub-centres all over the subcontinent with a view to stiffening the fibre of the Muslims so that they retain loyal to their traditions in the face of the difficulties of living under British rule. So that takes us up to the 19th century, but the individual I want to speak about mostly today is their disciple, and somebody of whom some people today in India still have a living memory. And this is Maulana Hussain Ahmed Madani, who in many ways was the one who kind of kept his hand on the tiller of Deoband and some other institutions in India in the mayhem after partition. So whereas Hadi Imdadullah and the earlier ones were dealing with the fact of the British coming to India, in the mid-20th century, the ulama having to deal with the fact of the British leaving India and Hindu domination in the context of a new nation-state democracy, Hindu chauvinism, and all of those other challenges. So again, a major transformation and a test of their claim that in their manhaj of teaching, in the understanding of fiqh, the Hanafi fiqh, the Maturidi doctrine, this Chishti silsila, there is an optimal way of being that will adequately guide the Muslims morally and politically through these sort of transformations, which obviously somebody like Baba Farid and Mu'aynuddin Chishti did not have to confront. So Maulana Hussain Ahmed Madani, born 1877, so this is after the mutiny, this is when the Raj is really in its full power and grandeur. His family are poor, but they have a memory of having seen civil servants under the Mughals and then under the Nawabs of Oudh, which is one of the earlier princely states, one that was displaced by the British. After the 1857 revolt, the British decided to cement their power by introducing something more resembling really a feudal system, creating large landowners, zamindars, talukdars, and dispossessing the smaller landowners and owners of individual plots, and they would give these large estates to people, native people, who they regarded as being loyal, pro-British sympathisers. So the father of Maulana Hussain is called Maulana Habibullah, has a connection to Deoband and is also really mainly known as a kind of Sufi pir and as a healer. One of the functions of the traditional Sufi murshid or sheikh is to heal people. And in the subcontinent they have indigenous traditions of medicine, not just prophetic medicine, but Unani medicine and so forth. And he was famous for this. And in particular, he was known as somebody who would vicariously heal. In other words, you went to him with a bad shoulder, and somehow the bad shoulder would be transmuted into the shoulder of Maulana Habibullah, and you'd feel fine, and he'd then have to deal with it in his own self, with exercises and so forth. And there would be infectious diseases as well as physiological ailments. So he's from that really very medieval world. In the city of Faizabad, which is the old capital of the Nawabs of Oudh, which is right across the river from Ayodhya, of course, which is a flashpoint. Then it was a mainly Muslim town. The 1992 demolition of the Babri Masjid there in many ways triggered the visible militancy of Hindu chauvinism in India. A very diverse place Big Hindu festivals all the time. Lots of Shi'i communities in that part of India with the Imam Baras everywhere and the Muharram rituals. So a very kind of pluralistic place with a slight Muslim majority, but basically it's cosmopolitan India with everybody being neighbours to everyone with often tensions as well as conviviality. So Maulana Habibullah has 5 sons, and he wants them all not to go to the British schools or the missionary schools or reformist schools, but to have a traditional Deobandi type education. Hussein was the one who liked to play most. So his father actually sent him away to Deoband to board there, to become a Maulvi. In those days in Deoband, it was normal for the students to stay in the houses of the scholars. They didn't really have a dormitory system at that time, so there was a strong kind of father-son relationship that developed between teachers and students. The particular ideology of the Deobandis then really is just classical mainstream Sunni Islam. It has nothing to do with reformism as such. We nowadays tend to think of the sort of besetting ill of the subcontinent and of many British mosques as being the Brailvi-Deobandi dispute. So somebody builds a Deobandi mosque and then 5 years later there's sure to be a Brailvi mosque that is slightly bigger on the same street, and then it's kind of crazy stupidity. And they say, oh, the Brailvis are Sufis and the Deobandis are kind of puritanical. But there have been some evolutions amongst some Deobandis, reactive relations with Ahl al-Hadith in India. But in this 19th century period, in the period when Hussain Ahmed Madani he becomes the rector, principal of Darul Uloom Deoband after partition, that the dispute is not really, are you a Sufi, are you not a Sufi, because everybody's a Sufi apart from small groups of Ahl al-Hadith who have no clout at all. But it's really to do with certain issues over the state of people in the grave and relatedly how you commemorate the Mawlid. Now, if you talk to sort of classically oriented scholars in most parts of the Islamic world, they say, well, everybody knows that these are matters that cannot be decisively known, and therefore there's sa'a in this. I remember when I was a student in Cairo at the Azhar, we had the first sort of British Darul Uloom graduates turned up, and the Indian students were amazed by them because the Indian students were wearing jeans at the Azhar, and the British Muslim students were in the kind of traditional pajama thing, very counterintuitive. And then the Brailvis were there, and would they pray together, and this and that. And so we went to some of the Azhari ulama, and they hammered out the issues that were between them. They said, well, these are just masail khilafiyya ja'iza. These are permissible points of dispute, because when it comes to how conscious somebody is in the barzakh, whether they can hear you, whether they can pray for you, these are issues which are not decisively resolved in Quran and Hadith, and the ulama have taken different views, and that's like a dream world, and it's difficult for us in this world really to conceptualize it. So in the end, neither the Deobandis nor the Brailvis were happy with the Azhari scholars' recommendation. I guess they wanted something a bit more polarizing. But this, in the 19th century, this became a very big disputational matter, and even affected some of the politics and the boundary drawing of partition. But the thing to bear in mind is that they take themselves to be simply the inheritors of a Sufi tradition, and the Chishti Sabri tradition is in many ways quite an ecstatic devotional tradition. The Naqshbandis tend to be historically a bit more sober. But in any case, individuals impose their own stamp on these as much as tradition. So he's been sent by Maulana Habibullah to study in Deoband. So let me just see if we can find a reminiscence here, rather than just having my voice for the next hour. One of the advantages about studying Hussein Ahmed is that he writes lots of kind of autobiographical tazkira type works about his experience in different places, so we can reconstruct his early life quite easily. Here he says later on, I never had much enthusiasm for study and would not study thoroughly or do much to review my books. As far as the beginning books, on which there was only an oral exam, I did well, but not so well in the later written ones. I failed 3 of 6 in the first year. The night before the exam, I would study the whole book and sleep only an hour or less. To stay awake, I would prepare salty tea, and whenever I felt sleepy, drink the tea and thus keep off the sleepiness for an hour or two. For I always needed much sleep, and I especially feel sleepy when reading. After I failed my exams for the first time, alhamdulillah, I did not fail again, and within my class I often attained good marks. Darul Uloom Deoband's exams from the beginning were made difficult, whether oral or written. When a student of the Darul Uloom entered government institutions or did exams after completing English classes, they were always the most distinguished. Although I was always unenthusiastic and shrank from any kind of work and sacrifice, thank Allah, gradually both my intellectual inclination and balance of character grew. At the very beginning, my interest was in logic and philosophy, and in literature and hadith. So you get a sense that he kind of seems to be an ordinary type of student, and nobody could have guessed at that point that he'd end up being the head of the Jamiat Ulama-i Hind and one of the most prolific authors as well as campaigners for Indian independence later on. He's just an ordinary boy from a small town. So, in the midst of this, he gets a message from his father, who has experienced what they call a jadba, in other words, an inner, overwhelming yearning to go and live in one of the holy cities. He wants to go and live in Medina. So the whole family are to move, and he ends his studies in Deoband. And before he leaves, he takes a formal bay'ah with Maulana Rashid Gangohi, who we saw was the great disciple of Haji Imdadullah. So he's got his bay'at, but as an alim, he's not hafiz, he's still on the way. So in 1898, the whole family move. And one of the advantages of going to the Hijaz is that Haji Imdadullah, who led the army in the mutiny, is still in Makkah, and they're able to sit at his feet. He's really old, but that's an opportunity for them to engage. They go to Makkah, and then they head for Medina, which in those days is like a 2-week journey. Now they've built a high-speed train, which is a bit of a strange thing to build for pilgrims when you think about it. So, the old thing was to sit on your camel or your mule, and you would study, you would talk to people, you would look at you would be prepared spiritually, leaving your worldly things and to enter the holy city. It was a form of respect for the sha'air, but now it's a high-speed train, 200 miles an hour, I got to. Oh, funny. So 4 days out from Makkah, he has a dream in which he sees the Holy Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam. And for the ulama, this is always, it's a true dream, ru'ya sadiqa. So he sees the Holy Prophet and he falls at his feet and asks him to pray for him to be a better student, so that he will remember what he learns and understand everything that he reads. And this is granted. He was, I guess, about 21 at the time. In Medina, things for the Indian family are hard. They start by opening a little shop, but it doesn't work too well, closes after about a year. So Sayyid Hussain Ahmed Madani has to find work, just doing a bit of tutoring or working as a copyist, writing out people's marriage certificates and things like that. And they actually build their own house with sort of lumps of rock and rammed clay. So they're living in considerable indigence. But they're in Medina now, Madanis. In 1900, he gets a letter from India. Maulana Rashid Gangohi is inviting him, says he's missing him and wants him to visit. Not so easy, the journey back then, even though there's always been a connection between India and Arabia, because they're not so far. You take the boat from Bombay and then via Aden and up the Red Sea. But still, if you have to work your passage, it can take weeks and weeks. So he comes to Delhi and then Deoband, and then he goes to see his teacher in this town, Gangur, which is about 25 miles, and he walks. And it's a famous walk in that he's said to have been crying the whole way, because he feels bad about meeting his teacher, and having to say, I just found work as a copyist and selling little books in Medina, and I'm still not a Hafiz, and I'm still not following your instructions. But when he gets to the Dargah and spends some time there, Maulana Rashid winds his own turban around his head, which is unmistakably a traditional sign of investiture and permission. And then he visits various mazars. He goes to a famous Chishti mazar, and then, having spent several months in India, goes back to Medina. So this is obviously why the Maulana has invited him, because he recognizes that he is to be a successor, which seems strange. He's only a kid, really, in a culture that validates age and dignity, but this surprising thing has happened. So in Medina, he goes back and immediately he starts to have dreams, and he actually writes down and describes some of these. There's 18 that he records. And very often he would see dreams in which the Holy Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam, or Ibrahim, or Maulana Rashid, or Haji Imdadullah would give him something to eat, dates or milk or something sustaining. Now in those days, Makkah and Medina were not what they are now, in that they were full of little madrasas and libraries. I read an article which listed the 30 libraries that used to exist in Medina until the mid-20th century. It was the case in the Ottoman Empire, in particular for statesmen, to go to Medina as a kind of retirement place. And in England, you retire to the Bahamas or Margate or something. But the Ottomans, Medina, of course, in the hope of being buried there. And very often these moneyed pashas would do something positive, like endow a library or a house for the Hajjis or a little hospital. So there was quite an elaborate infrastructure there. So it's a good place for students and always has been. And one of the reasons why the Haramain have been particularly critical in intellectual exchange in Islam is that, if you can imagine, before jet aircraft or trains or steamships, the Hajj, which was your obligation, had to be very carefully thought out, because to get there from West Africa or Indonesia or Samarkand or somewhere, you had to make sure that you got there well in advance, because if you missed Arafat, you have to wait until the next year. There's no way of, if you missed Arafat, that's it. So people will get there well in advance, and as the months drew, particularly from Ramadan to the Hajj, the Haramain were like university towns, and there would be great ulama from everywhere engaging. And also the smaller madrasas would be really busy. And nowadays, what do they do in the Mövenpick in Medina? You look out and there's the Haram, and it's kind of interesting to see people walking around, I guess. But there's a great big TV and a picture by Toulouse-Lautrec on the wall, and it's kind of space out entertainment culture. But back then, it wasn't like that. It was an opportunity really to turn around, to improve yourself, to be in circles of dhikr, to visit the madrasas, to enjoy the sohbah of the shuyukh. It was an amazing experience. It was really part of your visit to the Haramain. And of course, Jerusalem was fully integrated into all of this at the same time. So he's teaching, and starts to teach very hard. He becomes a teacher at something called the Madrasa Shamsiyya, which is one of the big Ottoman-founded madrasas in Medina. And he's known for teaching without notes, because he prepares at night from Fajr until Isha, and then sometimes afterwards. And later in life, his practice was to teach Bukhari after Isha. He would be at his most active then. It would be a 3-hour class every night. So quite hard for the young students, but he was full of energy for it. And he also taught in the Haram. Nowadays, you don't see that because the model now is for people to go to Mecca and Medina to do their ibadah and to go to Burger King and to buy a bottle of perfume and a leaky bottle of Zamzam, and off you go. But then, it wasn't just the libraries and the madrasas, but the haram itself, not just the other madrasas, but the haram itself, every column had a scholar sitting and talking. Nobody was controlling it, there was nobody in charge of it. Anybody with an ijazah, because if you started just talking and you couldn't show that some well-known alim had authorized you, nobody would want to listen. It was a kind of self-selecting process, that it was a truly amazing place. And particularly in the days before electricity, because during the day, it's hot, people have a long siesta, but at night, when the tawashi would come out and light all of the olive oil lamps in the haram in Mecca, it was a truly amazing and magical spectacle, and the sound of Quran and people studying everywhere. It was very reverent and very intense and astonishing. So he's part of that, and is a teacher and is certainly respected by this time. His Arabic is really amazing. And later on, some of the arguments in his polemics about partition relate to the fact that supposedly he doesn't understand Arabic words properly. Iqbal accuses him of this. Iqbal's Arabic was probably a little bit questionable, but he is a master of the Arabic language. So in 1909, he goes back to India. His wife has died in Medina, and he marries again. Spends some time in Deoband and refreshes his knowledge of hadith under somebody called Maulana Mahmud al-Hassan, who is the great hadith scholar in Deoband at the time. Maulana Mahmud al-Hassan then goes to the Hijaz, and Maulana Hussein goes back as well. There's a lot of toing and froing. And then in 1914, the Great War begins. And this is immediately a problem for any British subject in the Holy Cities, because the Holy Cities are part of the Ottoman Empire, which is at war with the British Empire. So a huge problem. The Turks don't make difficulties for them, even though technically they're enemy aliens, but they just continue teaching and nobody really cares. And Ghalib Pasha, who is the governor of the Hijaz, actually goes out of his way to make sure that the scholars are not interfered with. But the Ottoman Empire is really no match for the British Empire on one side and the Russians on the other. And on a visit to Mecca in 1916, the Arab revolt takes place. Lawrence of Arabia and the Sharif Hussain and all of that romantic nonsense, which was basically just a piece of imperial manipulation and mischief making after the British had failed so catastrophically at Gallipoli. 250,000 men died or were casualties on either side. The biggest ever defeat the British Empire suffered really was by the so-called sick man of Europe in the Dardanelles, Churchill's greatest debacle. So the idea was to weaken the Ottoman Empire by trying to detach the Arabs from their loyalties to the Sultan Caliph in Constantinople. That had already been done successfully in the 19th century to detach the Balkan provinces, which, as we saw with the Ebu Saud lecture, were really considered to be the heartlands of the Ottoman Empire by the Ottomans themselves. But with the Balkan Wars in 1912, Albania went, what's now Macedonia went, southern Montenegro, western Thrace, and there's just a little kind of amputated stump of Turkey in Europe, which is still there. But it's not on the borders of Austria any longer. It's small. So they wanted to do the same thing to the Arab provinces. The trouble was that the Arabs weren't really nationalist, unlike the Serbs and the Bosnians and the Albanians and the Greeks and the others, because they were thinking in more specifically religious terms. They remembered the Crusades unhappily, and The Sultan Caliph, particularly Sultan Abdul Hamid, were really popular in the Arab world. Abdul Hamid did a lot for the Haramain. He built the Hijaz Railway, and nobody saw any point in rebelling. So the British eventually had to bribe a few tribesmen. No Arabs ever defected from the Ottoman army to go over to the side of the British or the Arab rebels. The Arabs in the Ottoman army were completely loyal and also fought at Gallipoli, incidentally, on Enver Pasha's mission into the Caucasus, which wasn't a great success. So they just saw themselves as Ottomans. So for the British, this was a problem. So they managed to get the Sharif Hussein in Mecca with a promise of sovereignty after the war. Told him, sun has set on the empire of the Turks. Now it's going to be an Arab kingdom under our tutelage, whether you like it or not, and we'll make you king of Arabia, and we'll probably make you Khalifa. The Khalifa should be an Arab anyway, as long as you throw off your allegiance to the Turks. And the Sharif Hussein bought this. And with the help of Lawrence of Arabia and the Arab Bureau in Cairo and British gold, they managed to get Mecca to secede from the Khilafah, which is a fairly extreme thing. So this is going on, and clearly the situation of British subjects in the holy cities is an increasingly precarious one, because they were British subjects living under the enemy Ottomans, and now they're British subjects, but the British are pulling the strings behind this new, rather ghostly kingdom of the Hijaz. And indeed, in 1916, the group of scholars, Maulana Mahmud al-Hassan and Hussain Ahmed Madani, are arrested by order of the Sharif of Mecca. Now, the British in the Arab Bureau in Cairo have drafted a fatwa in which they declare that the Ottomans are kafir, and that it's an obligation for Muslims to fight against the Ottoman Empire in the interests of the British King Emperor. And the ulama everywhere in the British Empire are being pressed to sign this strange fatwa, which is endorsed in Mecca by an obscure scholar who has now been made the Sheikh al-Islam. The real Sheikh al-Islam, of course, is still in Constantinople. But this scholar, who is rather terrified of the Sharif Hussein, is going around getting everybody in Mecca to sign this thing, saying the Turks are kafirs and the British are protectors of true religion. And then he comes to the place where Maulana Mahmud al-Hassan and Hussain Ahmed Madani are staying, and says, you have to sign this thing. The Turks are kuffar. And they say, and they have to be evasive because the consequences could be disastrous. They say, well, this is just for the ulama of Makkah and we've got nothing to do with this. We're from India, this is not our document. So he comes back the next day and it's got the same fatwa, but the words "and the Turks are kafir" have kind of disappeared, hoping that this will be more acceptable, but they still won't sign it. And so, with the orders of the British pilgrim officer in Jeddah, a certain Colonel Wilson, they are arrested and put on mules and taken to Jeddah, accused of plotting with the Ottomans, because in Medina they've been hanging out with Ghalib Pasha and some of the Ottoman statesmen there, and it seems pretty obvious that they've been consorting with the enemy. So the times are very tense, and this, of course, is a traumatic and horrible experience for the ulama. So they're taken to Jeddah under guard, and we have to ask ourselves why the British are doing this. Did they really believe that these Indian ulama were in cahoots with the Ottomans and trying to stir up sedition? Well, of course, the relations between the ulama and the British had always been uncomfortable, since the Muslims basically took the lead in the first Indian War of Independence in 1857. And a lot of the scholars, Haji Abdal himself, were associated with that. And that Chishti Sabri line that ended up becoming very organized in Deoband was obviously subject to some British colonial suspicion, even though Deoband was not political. But there was one alim, Maulana Ubaidullah Sindhi, who was an interesting person, who was actually a Sikh convert in his teenage years. He converted to Islam, but managed to become an alim at Deoband, organized some of the Deoband graduates into something called the Jamiat al-Ansar, which again was not really political or explicitly anti-British, but clearly was some kind of mobilized group. And Maulana Mahmud al-Hassan had a close relationship with him and was constantly corresponding with him. So we have Ubaidullah Sindhi, during the First World War, goes to the northwest frontier province, all of those 7-foot-tall frowning Pashtuns, to try and foment a rebellion against the British. They're always rebelling against everybody and against each other, but this is to be a jihad against the British, specifically in order to establish an independent India, to meet up with Muslims in Central Asia, who will then rise up against the Tsar because Russia is in disarray. And he writes a letter to Mahmud al-Hassan telling him what he's doing and asking for his support. Now the British, through a spy, intercept the letter, which is written on silk to make it easy to hide. And this is called the Silk Letter Conspiracy, which is one of the episodes of the British Raj in India. And as a result, Mahmud al-Hassan immediately comes under suspicion, which seems to be why the British have had him led away under arrest with whoever happens to be in his house at the time. Now, this starts to politicize them a lot more, because it's very obvious what the British are up to in the Hijaz. The Arabs are still staunchly pro-Ottoman, but these wild tribes have been told that they will get British gold and the right to pillage Damascus if they fight with Lawrence. It's very transparently a piece of imperial manipulation. And although we think of that period and the parceling up of the Middle East according to lines of colonial influence, the creation of countries like Lebanon and Jordan and Iraq, places that had not been countries before, lines that were drawn across the desert by a bunch of men in a smoke-filled room in the Palace of Versailles, as the kind of original sin that has caused the instability of the Middle East. It's also had a big impact in Muslims elsewhere, and particularly in India, in strengthening anti-British feeling. Because the kind of deceit of it was particularly offensive to Muslim sensibility. On the one hand, the British had written to the Sharif Hussain, promising him that he would be an Arab sovereign, and the Arabs would receive their independence under some kind of vague British imperial supervision, and the French would have Syria. But they'd also signed secret Sykes-Picot Accords. So Mark Sykes, our former principal here, Mohammed Assad's written a great book about Mark Sykes in that period, where the British and the French had secretly written another agreement saying, no, these silly Arabs aren't going to get any kind of independence, it's just going to be colonial rule. The British will get Iraq, and the French will get Syria and Lebanon, and file closed. So that kind of deceit was particularly regarded as particularly sleazy and disgraceful, particularly to these kind of classical Sufi ulama who really respected men who kept their word. But this was a nasty form of nifaq and did a lot to galvanize what became the Khilafat movement in India, which was one of the currents that moved into the campaign against British rule and for Indian independence. So the Hussein McMahon correspondence, which is where the British said, you'll be top dog, and the secret Sykes-Picot correspondence, where they said, actually, no, we're just going to take over ourselves. Are very significant documents. If you've seen the film A Dangerous Man, which is basically about the betrayal of the Arabs at the Treaty of Versailles, you'll see that, and they're still really angry about it. I remember once a Jordanian taxi driver saying, we're not really Jordanians. You always have to be polite to taxi drivers in the Arab world. Yes. No, we're not Jordanians. It's all sham, it's all sham. Palestine and Lebanon and Syria and all those silly countries, we always used to be together. We speak the same kind of Arabic with the same people. Just you British who kind of ruined everything. So, all right. Probably correct. But the British, of course, thought this is imperial planning, this is going to go on forever. They never really thought that they would be independent countries. But in any case, these are very, very traumatic times. And it's like 100 years ago, and everybody's been commemorating the end of the First World War and the Battle of Verdun, the last post, etc., etc. But Europe kind of has recovered. But the Middle East, still suffering. You should read David Fromkin's book, A Peace to End All Peace, where he talks about the catastrophes of the map drawing that took place at the Treaty of Versailles. Let's create a place called Yugoslavia, they thought. Let's put Albanians in it, and Slovenes, and Croats, and Serbs. They hate each other, and Bosnia, and Montenegro. It'll be the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. It's never existed before. And then, of course, when authoritarian rule ends, Tito dies, Milosevic takes over, bang! Yes, it's an unreal nation state. And the same happens for so many of those fantasy states that were created at the Treaty of Versailles, Iraq. Let's put the Kurds together with the Sunnis and the Shia and the Turkmen and the Yazidis and the Christians, and it's going to be just great. Kind of handy for extracting oil, I guess. But that didn't work so well either. In any case, a century has gone by and we're still suffering the peace to end all peace. But for the Indians, they could see what a momentously awful thing was being done at these places that had been united under the Khilafat, and before that under the Mamluks for 1,000 years or more, were now going to become Syria and Lebanon and these strange borders, dividing people and checkpoints everywhere and passports. This was a monstrosity and really tended to exacerbate anti-imperial and anti-British feelings. So the Silk Letter conspiracy is part of that. People are really angry. So they're under arrest in Jeddah. They don't know where they're going to go, but they assume they're going to be taken to India. But they're not. They're put on a ship and taken to Egypt. They stay in a kind of encampment, a prisoner of war place just outside Cairo. They're interrogated by a tribunal where they make the fatal admission that actually the Turkish rule in the Hijaz was a lot better than the Sharif Hussein. And the verdict on that was that they were disloyal and that they should be interned on the island of Malta, the opposite direction to India. And they're sent with a lot of prisoners of war, basically Ottoman loyalists, Ottoman officers and others, civil servants who are going to be interned. And the sea voyage is somewhat dangerous. There's submarines and it's wartime. But Maulana Hussein Ahmed has a piece of the turban cloth of Haji Imdadullah, tears it up and gives one to each of the members of the group for tabarrukat in order to keep them safe during the sea passage. So he arrives in Malta, and it's a huge prisoner of war camp, about 3,000 prisoners of lots of different nationalities. There's kind of Prussians with monocles, as well as sort of Syrian pashas. Everybody is there. 4 layers of barbed wire outside. It's like Colditz, but really multinational. And the pro-Ottoman Egyptians and Syrians, Lebanese, Palestinians are there as well. So they organize a mosque. They get prison blankets and they create a mosque. And the Syrians, who are real Ottoman patriots, managed to stitch together an Ottoman flag and keep raising it to the annoyance of the British guards. And it's the usual situation in any prison where there are interrogations and then spies and stool pigeons, and petitions are coming from India because these are like the best known Muslim scholars in India. So people are writing to the British saying, you can't arrest our Maulanas. His father is Maulana Habibullah, of course, is still in Medina, eking out a living. When the Sharif Hussein's forces, after the siege of Medina, which is a very kind of heroic event, and the last train to leave Medina railway station going north when the Sharif Hussein's forces are besieging the city, it has they take the relics of the Prophet's mosque with them, the Prophet's sword and his turban and the athar and the tabarrukat that have always been kept in the haram in Medina, taken up, and everybody's weeping. And of course, they're still in Istanbul to this day, where you can see them. That siege is something worth reading about. But the Sharif Hussein's forces take over, and so Maulana Habibullah is arrested. But he's arrested by the Turks, that's right, as a British subject under suspicion, and is taken off to Edirne in European Turkey, where he dies, and the news gets to Maulana Hussain Madani in Malta, and of course is greatly affected by this. But by this time, the Hijaz has been taken, Palestine has been taken, the two battles of Gaza, the first when the Ottomans are victorious, and then when they're defeated, and from that time really Gaza, which used to be just an ordinary Syrian sleepy place, has become one of the great tragedy zones on earth. And somehow these ulama, the Muslims who saw the collapse of this ancient traditional order, somehow intuited the human catastrophes that were to come. And in our time, it still goes on. Look at the governability of Syria and Iraq, and it's all from that period. Iraq, under the Ottomans for 400 years, didn't have a single major episode of sectarian conflict. Not one. The Ottoman sultans used to send purses of gold to endow the Shi'i shrines at Karbala and Najaf and the Kazemain, and that was just kind of normal. They were just neighbours. And now look at it. So there was something of an intuition in many Muslim souls at the time that some kind of great darkness is coming. Maulana is working away, Mahmud al-Hassan, and they have access to pen and paper. So this is where Maulana Hussain Madani completes his great commentary on Bukhari, which is a very monumental work. But they do a lot of dhikr, and they have a very holy presence. So the British guards, when they go past them, couldn't stop taking their hats off to them, which is not prison regulations at all. You don't find a guard in strange ways sort of taking his hat off to a particular prisoner, unless it's a mafia boss who can threaten him. But just out of respect for a prisoner, it doesn't, the prison environment isn't like that. Sometimes the British guards would even bow to Maulana Hussain Ahmed, because holiness has an effect. The people have an extraordinary charisma. And some of the Syrian prisoners there, mostly from the Ottoman Navy, took bay'ah with him, and the tariqah started to spread in Syria. So we have another, let's listen to his words again. 45. Glasses. Magically dematerialized. Here we are. We actually have a book, Asirani Malta. It's in Urdu, but there's an English translation. We have it in the CMC library upstairs, which is a very detailed account in a kind of traditional fada'il or manaqib genre. It's like his miracles and the people who converted at his hands, and it's a spiritual prison diary. So later on, Maulana Hussain Ahmed writing about his teacher, wrote this: "In short, the truth of the matter is that Maulana Mahmud al-Hassan in his whole life had never had such an opportunity for spiritual work, inner progress, and intimacy with his true beloved like the days of his stay on Malta. It was a true gift from Allah for achieving the stages of inner progress. The eternal writer made this journey and this imprisonment the means for achieving those stages he had fixed for him from eternity. And once achieved, he sent him to his homeland and then summoned him." So Maulana Hussein Ahmed, who's a very apt student by now, learns Turkish while he's here and completes finally his hifz of the Quran, and is really well known for showing and being esteemed by all the prisoners for having amazing compassion for them all. So another text from this amazing diary. So this is what he writes later on. "Among these 3,000, some were Muslims, some Christians, some Jews, some Catholics, some were black, some white, some Eastern, some Western, some civilian, some military, some Asian, some African, some European, some Turkish, but trouble joined all in such a bond that each was ready to sacrifice his life, and in his heart everyone breathed well-being for the other. This was an extraordinary vision, as if the differences of religion, nation, and homeland had completely disappeared from the human world, as if each was the other's real brother. Everyone viewed the English officers and soldiers with real anger, but looked at each prisoner with an eye of dignity and respect." So this goes on. 11th of November, of course, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the armistice is signed and the guns fall silent. They expect to be released, because they're getting newspapers, they know what's going on. But the Arab Bureau in Cairo, which is planning this new British-French suzerainty over the Middle East, and is also interested in India, because Aden is for a long time administered from Bombay, decides not to release them because they are undesirable Indians and Mohammedan malcontents. They haven't actually been able to convict them of anything. It's just kind of hearsay, rumour. We think you were in this majlis with the Ottoman Pasha, and we think that you've been corresponding with Ubaydullah Sindhi, and why did he send you this letter? But they can't actually convict them of anything. In 1920, finally, because there's no evidence at all, and there's a lot of pressure coming from Indian Muslims, they are released. From Malta back to India, it takes them 3 months. Chaos after the war, the Middle East is in uproar. They don't have any money, but they are met by a rapturous crowd, a welcoming party at the docks in Bombay. Gandhi is there, the Deobandi leaders, and also activists of a new movement called the Khilafat Movement, which is an Indian Muslim movement concerned at British and ultimately Kemalist plans to abolish the Khilafah itself in order to facilitate British rule. He didn't go back to Medina, but his experience in prison has turned him into a kind of activist, Maulana. The Indian Muslims in this time of the Khilafat movement are very alienated by clear British anti-Ottomanism. Now, before this time, the idea of the caliph, the Khalifa, had never really been a very big idea in India. Until the early 16th century, the Delhi sultans, the Tughlaqs and so forth, had the Khalifa, the Abbasid Khalifa, who at this time was living in a kind of exile in a palace in Cairo, mentioned in khutbahs, but otherwise it wasn't really a live principle. And some of the Mughal sultans had made caliphal claims for themselves, but the list of titles was so gigantic: Lord of the Sun and the Moon, Lord of the East and the West, Master of the Horizons, Master of 1,000 Elephants. By the time you got to Khalifa, nobody was reading that far, so it wasn't really part of their legitimation in the Mughal world. And of course they were aware that it was a claim made by the Ottoman sultans, particularly in the 18th and 19th century, as Ottoman military fortunes started to wane. So the British then had this idea that the Sharif Hussain could be induced to declare himself to be Khalifa and could then bring the whole Arab world and maybe the whole Islamic world into British allegiance. There are letters from him that indicate this, that have been released in the India Office archives. So in 1919, something called the All India Khilafat Movement was founded out of anger at the kind of slicing up of the Arab world, the Balfour Declaration, what was going to happen to Palestine. And they were supported by Gandhi as well. And Maulana Mahmud al-Hassan declared his support, was given the title Sheikh al-Hind. And they lent their weight to many of the early Gandhian campaigns of civil disobedience, not buying British products and not standing up when a European entered the room, that kind of thing. Partnered with a lot of other Muslims, including, interestingly, some Cambridge-educated Muslims. Somebody called Saifuddin Kichlew, I probably pronounced that wrongly, was at Peterhouse here in the late 19th century. There was something called the Cambridge Majlis here, which was founded in about 1891, for not just Muslim, but there were a lot of Muslims in it, Indian students who were in Cambridge, and they would get together and talk society politics, talk about their aspirations. Later on there was an Oxford Majlis as well. People like Maulana Yusuf Ali, when he was in Cambridge, the translator of the Quran, he was at St John's College. Iqbal were all kind of, as it were, graduates of this circle of Cambridge-based Muslim intellectuals. So this is an opportunity for the Maulana to engage with some of the more kind of Western-educated Muslims in India who are often much more active as nationalists than the ulama were, who tend to prefer the traditional distance that the ulama maintain from the Sultan. So the British don't like this, and in Karachi he is tried for anti-British agitation, and true to the sort of principles of non-cooperation, they refuse to stand for the judge, and they don't acknowledge the legitimacy of the court. And he gets sentenced to 2 years rigorous imprisonment, which means that at night he's chained and the food is really bad. He's released 2 years later, but then in 1924 the Khilafah is abolished by Ataturk, and the movement kind of gets a bit adrift. It staggers on for a few more years, but the wind has gone out of its sails, and also there's growing dissension between Hindus and Muslims, and Muslim identity politics in India starts to take on a different tenor. Still, the moment he's out of prison, he resumes his anti-British preaching, pointing particularly to the cynical carve-up of the Middle East. And he's preaching against communalism, because he says that for the different groups in India to war on each other simply serves British colonial interests, because the Raj justifies itself as the white man's burden. If the white man goes, the Indians will all kill each other, as allegedly they did before. And similarly, he didn't like Sunni Shi'i disputations, which were quite sharp at this time. He was very strong in his disagreement with the Shia, but he didn't like that to reflect itself in any kind of communalism. Maulana Mahmud al-Hassan passes away, and he moves off to distant Sylhet in order to teach hadith. He's always been really a man who is not afraid of discomfort and going to out-of-the-way places. And one of his great delights, according to his biographers, was just to go to villages and to talk about Islam, the Quran and the Sunnah and the lives of the great ones. And even if only half a dozen people came and kind of stood with their mouths open, sort of on the way to the paddy fields, he'd be really happy. And that was, it is said, his greatest delight. So a kind of tabligh is something that he starts as well. And he creates a kind of India-wide organization for a kind of alim-based re-Islamization, because the Hindu militants have been launching campaigns to bring very superficially Islamized populations back into Hinduism. Organizations like the Arya Samaj are sending missionaries essentially around the countryside, to go to people who have Muslim names but may be only nominally Muslim and are in practice observing the Hindu calendar and Hindu deities, to re-assimilate them, the process of Shuddhi back into Hinduism. So movements like the Tablighi Jamaat and Maulana Hussain Madani's organisation are very much part of the pushing back against this Hindu militancy. And their organisation also tries to fight some un-Islamic practices. So he has this idea that the Muslim birth rate is smaller than the Hindu birth rate in India because Muslims marry later and because sometimes they don't marry at all. And the reason for that is cultural expectations about extravagant weddings. So he issues a series of fatwas indicating what a true Islamic wedding should be, and that the money you save should be used to establish yourself in a business or some other halal form of income. And that's one of the things that he is remembered for. Of course, he's still very much in the Deobandi orbit. The head of Darul Uloom Deoband, Maulana Anwar Shah Kashmiri, goes off to establish another big Darul Uloom in Gujarat, and Maulana Hussein Ahmed is invited to take his place and be the Grand Rector of this extraordinarily prestigious institution. He doesn't particularly want to do it, but he says, if you agree to my 27 conditions, all right, I will come. And one of those conditions is that Darul Uloom Deoband will not stand aloof from anti-British campaigning in India. So the kind of quietist ulama to be sidelined. And he also includes other conditions, such as, he says, haven't seen this in a recent academic contract, if I happen to miss a lecture, the regulations must specify that that is to be deducted from my salary. So it's the kind of purist approach. And they say, all right, and they let him in, and he becomes rises to this position of considerable eminence. Now, the ulama by this time are being contested in their claim to be the natural leaders of the ummah by different kinds of organizations. You've got the Muslim League starting up with Jinnah, who is this Lincoln's Inn educated, very anglicized individual who, as far as anybody can tell, is not particularly religiously observant and is really more at home with sort of anglicized and British elites than with traditional Muslims, with a kind of nationalistic idea. And then you have Iqbal's idea of a kind of romantic Muslim nationalism, influenced by all of the ideas and visions and sometimes quite interesting insights that he picked up here in Cambridge and elsewhere. And like Jinnah, he's not really at ease with the ulama. And then you've got Maududi, who more or less openly disrespects the ulama and says that they are obscurantists and that they have veiled the shining face of the Quran and the Hadith with all of their hair-splitting disputations, and that he, Maududi, writes that because of an inner light, he is able to tell whether a hadith is strong or weak just by looking at it. He doesn't need to go to all of the ulama's yellow books about jarh and ta'dil and assessing isnad. He can tell spontaneously, and this, of course, completely short-circuits the whole traditional mechanisms of Islamic scholarship. So there's these three groups who are Muslim groups that are kind of not on side with the ulama and competing with them for popularity. Most of the ulama groupings are allying themselves with Congress and the movement for sort of Indian national liberation against the British. The Majlisi Ahrar, which is a big group in most of its territories, are now in what's called Pakistan nowadays, which is very much a kind of poor relief type scholars activist organisation, very much in the Chishti tradition, and were particularly active in upholding the rights of Muslims in Kashmir, which was a Muslim majority province but under a Hindu Raja, and they were historically quite browbeaten. And then you've got the famous movement of Abdul Ghaffur Khan amongst the Pathans, who improbably, for a Pathan, creates a kind of Islamic pacifism in order to resist the British. But the Muslim League is the group that seems to be growing fast, even though Jinnah's natural habitat tends to be with the aristocrats. So Jinnah is talking to westernized intellectuals, aristocrats and princes from the princely states, whereas the ulama's support tends to come from the grassroots. The British are also emphasizing that their role in India is to, as it were, be referees between two competing teams, and that but for the referee, the rules would be cast aside and mayhem would ensue. And they do a lot to promote particularly the zealous sides of Hindu nationalism and Muslim nationalism. The story is still coming out, but it's becoming evident now that Whitehall's role was quite a nefarious one at a time when Churchill, for instance, was absolutely determined and desperate that India would remain the jewel in the crown. So in 1937, Hussain Ahmed Madani writes a book, Muttahida Qawmiyat Awr Islam, which is an interesting document in that it is really written from a very classical Hanafi Maturidi perspective, explaining what Islam actually could make of nationalism, which is the dominant ideology in the world at the time, whether of the left or of the right, and certainly the way in which anti-colonialism was expressing itself. If the movement against the British in India is a nationalism, what should be the role of the ulama when nationalism is something that comes out of the European experience? What on earth can be our role in this? Do we just go along with it? Can we find ways of justifying it in the Quran or the Sunnah? Or do we have to oppose it? Or do we have an alternative vision? So he proposes a kind of alternative vision. And he is very much targeting these different voices, Iqbal, Jinnah, and also Maududi, who he sees as people who are speaking for Islam, but not really with a sufficient knowledge base and a sufficient authorization and continuity with the classical past. So in many ways it's a restatement of the classical, even medieval Islamic understanding of how government works. And Iqbal writes a poem attacking him. He's quite sick by this time, he dies the next year, but he writes a Persian poem in which he calls the head of Darul Uloom Deoband the Abu Lahab of the time, because he's apparently opposing the way of the Holy Prophet, which is about the Muslims and the Ummah and the traditional way. And then he writes a counter-refutation, and his understanding in India, because by this time things are looking quite dire, and he certainly doesn't want the region to be divided the way the British divided the Middle East, which seems to be the usual British policy. In power and when leaving power, you just divide it up into smaller bits and step back and watch the fun. That his view is that if you look at the classical Islamic sources and set aside sort of journalistic or philosophical or nationalistic considerations, you find that there are three principles that should be guiding the ulama looking at this. Do we stay with the British? Do we stay with United India? Do we support the idea of cutting India up into Muslim and Hindu bits? There's 3 points, he says. Firstly, the Sunnah validates alliances with non-Muslims. So he talks about this famous constitution of Medina that the Holy Prophet forged with the Jews when he arrived there. There's plenty of other examples. You can collaborate politically with non-Muslims. Secondly, Muslims are people of faithfulness who keep their promises and are honourable neighbours. And thirdly, the Muslims belong in India. Hindu nationalists and a certain British narrative regard them as legacies of outsider conquest. But actually they are locals. This is Hindustan, is their country, and the landscape is full of mosques and zawiyas and graveyards, and it's Hindustan. Muslims are not kind of camping out. So his arguments are religious arguments, they're Islamic arguments, and his concern is that partition would divide the Muslims into maybe 3 different bits, but unite the Hindus. So in an attempt to avoid Hindu predominance in the region, it would actually cement it, because it would be the Muslims who would be divided and the Hindus who would be united. And he also has an aside at Maududi, who he calls, and he's never really abusive, he doesn't call anybody Abu Lahab, but Maududi he calls a journalist, a writer of articles and editorials, who should not be giving fatwas. Nobody's authorized him to give fatwas. So this idea of partition to him looks as if it's going to leave the Muslims in the lurch and destabilize the region the way the British destabilized and the French destabilized the Middle East. And his own bitter experience of seeing the consequences of the First World War in the Middle East probably informed this view. Second World War happens, and the future of British rule becomes even more ambiguous. Subhas Chandra Bose has taken a bit of the Indian army to side with the Japanese in the hope that a Japanese-sponsored Indian independence would be the best thing for the subcontinent. There's thousands of them, and they're just waiting in Burma to cross the border into Assam. The idea being that the Indian population will then rise up against the white man and welcome the joint Japanese-Indian liberators, which could have happened. The British were really unpopular, particularly given the manipulations of the Bengal Famine in 1942, which is worth reading about. Basically, the story of the Bengal Famine is that in order to prevent the Japanese from landing on the coasts of eastern India, the British destroyed the infrastructure of the coasts, and they also diverted grain ships away from India to go to Britain and also stockpile for a putative Allied invasion of the Balkans. So Britain was not hungry during the Second World War, despite all the U-boat attacks, but several million Indians, basically in Bengal, disproportionately Muslims, died as a result of those manipulations. So people are, if you look out of the window of the train and there's people, starving children and corpses around, you tend to think twice about the alleged civilizing benefits of colonial rule. And indeed, there hasn't been a famine in India since independence. Where are the imperial arguments? So the Muslims have decided that a decision has to be taken. Is it going to be united Hindustan with Muslims at about 25 or 30% of the population? Or is the continent to be divided, which tends to be the British preference, partly as a way of saying, I told you so. 1940, the Lahore Resolution calls for partition, and Hussain Ahmed Madani continues with his polemic. He tends to be more strongly anti-British, but also strongly anti-partition. And you can see in his writings at this time anxieties about the nature of modernity itself. The technology, when weaponized, is infinitely more threatening than anything human beings have seen before, and that the breakdown in order would be unbelievably calamitous. So he writes about Hindustan as a Muslim land and as the historic responsibility of Muslims to remain everywhere in the land in order to continue the Chishti process of proselytization and converting people. He even has a theory that because of Adam's Peak in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, the first human being on earth was actually in India, but was a person of Tawheed. So in a sense, the Muslims were in India before the Hindus came along. So to say, as the Hindu nationalists did, that Muslims are kind of foreigners doesn't really make much sense. The Muslims are the original Indians, and the virtue in India is all prophetic. It comes from the Nur Muhammadi. And he also has an interesting argument, I'm not quite sure what to make of it, that when Indians die, if they're Hindus, they're cremated and they kind of leave the earth. But when Muslims die, they're buried in the land of India, and therefore the land is kind of full of Muslims. It's a Muslim land, but interesting. So more attacks on Maududi as a kind of philosopher and somebody who's unwilling to understand that so much of Islam is about the recognition of local particularities, the urf and the ada, whereas Maududi tends to be purist and ideological. So Maududi says, a non-Muslim can never lead Muslims. Remember, Maududi's been brought up in the Nizam of Hyderabad's domains, where the Nizam is ruling a substantially non-Muslim population, so he's used to that scenario. Then the Maulana says, well, does that mean that you could never have, for instance, a non-Muslim head of the post office, or a non-Muslim headmaster in a school, or a non-Muslim anything with any position of authority? He just doesn't accept it. And as for the idea of Islamic rule, an Islamic government, an Islamic state, he goes through it very meticulously and says there is no consensus amongst the ulama as to how the ideal form of government for Muslims should be. But one thing that you cannot have is the idea of Islamic law becoming enacted as statutory law, because the Sharia doesn't work like that. If you're westernized, you assume Islamic law is like British law and the legislature enacts it and it becomes the law of the land. But the Sharia doesn't operate like that, because it is not state law, and it's not one of the capacities of the Sultan to enact legislation. We saw this when we talked about Abu Sa'ud Effendi and how limited were the actual powers of the Ottoman Sultan, which is counterintuitive, but it is the case. The Sharia is a local, communal, guild-based, bottom-up type of legislation that doesn't have any kind of overarching control from above. So he's having a go at what we now call Islamists on those grounds as well. So he gets angry and he writes tracts like An Open Letter to the Muslim League. What is the Muslim League? What is Pakistan? He talks about Jinnah's Islamic inauthenticity and how his culture is basically British rather than Islamic. But not all the ulama agree with him. Shabir Ahmed Osmani and others think that things are going to get so bad that we do need our independent Pakistan, and partition is the only way. So in 1947, he lives through the horrors, incredible cyclone of partition, millions massacred on both sides, and he sees people getting on trains, leaving Delhi, and their children left behind, and 70% of the Muslim population of Delhi leaves. But he doesn't leave. He urges patience. He's a Sabari, after all. And together with Maulana Zakaria Kandahlawi, they issue a proclamation urging Muslims not to leave Delhi. This is the great Muslim city with the great mosques and the great shrines and Nizamuddin Awliya and that whole infrastructure. How can you abandon it? How can you leave it to others? But still, most Muslims in Delhi leave, and as in Hyderabad and a lot of other formerly Muslim-shaped places in the subcontinent, they're now kind of sad places, abandoned. Partition takes place, nonetheless, despite his intentions, and he then turns Darul Uloom Deoband into something less political. The British are gone, and he focuses more on trying to uplift the remaining Indian Muslims to a reform of akhlaq and ilm, and becomes a sort of significant but not political figure in the early years of independent India. 1955, he makes his last Hajj, and just 2 years before his death, and he's able to go back via Lahore, via Pakistan, to visit his pupils. And then he goes on, because the borders were open in those days, back to Deoband, and I'm going to end with quote that indicates that despite the politics and everything, he really should be seen as a selfless Sufi murshid. So this is one of the narratives of his train journey back from his Hajj. This is from one of his editors. When Hazrat Maulana Madani returned from his final Hajj, we came to the station in Lahore for the honour of seeing him. Sharaf-i-ziyarat. Among those in relationship with him was Sahibzade Muhammad Arif from district Jung, which is in the Punjab, who accompanied him as far as Deoband. And he told me the following story. On the train, there was also a Hindu gentleman who experienced a call of nature and went to attend to it. Clearly unhappy, he came right back. If you've been to public toilets in that part of the world, you'll understand why he came back and he was still uncomfortable. Anyway, Hazrat Maulana Madani understood what had happened and immediately gathered some empty cigarette packets and a jug of water and went and cleaned the toilet. Then he said to the Hindu man, "Please go, the toilet is clean, perhaps because it was night you couldn't see it properly." And the youth said, "Maulana, I saw how the toilet was," but he got up and went. He found the toilet was indeed completely clean. He was much moved and with great conviction said, "Your Honour's huzur, kindness, cherishing of servants is beyond comprehension." And there's so many stories that are told about him of that kind, which kind of indicates what sort of person the alim who is properly inflected by the suluk of tasawwuf can be. Complete selflessness and complete lack of self-regard, but concern for others. But of course his vision of a united Hindustan in which Islam would continue to progress didn't take place. We don't know what the end game will look like, but with both sides bristling with nuclear warheads and nationalists louder than ever on both sides, things are looking a little bit ominous. But in any case, history is in Allah's hands, but it is as well to bear in mind the struggles of that generation, lest we think that religion, an authentic ulama religion in its highest form, is about dichotomy and polarization, because it isn't. Adam is Indian as well. So, thank you very much. I've got to travel shortly, but inshallah we'll see you all the next instalment of these leadership lectures. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Cambridge Muslim College, training the next generation of Muslim thinkers.